Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for a random review today. My name is Mike Hansen, and I am a reference librarian at the Corvallis-Benton County Public Library, as well as co-coordinator of random review with my fellow librarian, Bonnie Brzezowski. Today, we have Dr. Helen Gao with us, reviewing Remember, the Science of Memory and the Art of Forgetting by Lisa Genova. Next month, local author Kate Hope Day will be reviewing Cloud Cuckoo Land by Anthony Doerr. You can sign up for that event on the Random Review webpage on the library's website. If you missed previous two reviews, you can also find links to those on that same webpage. I'd like to acknowledge Friends of the Corvallis-Benton County Public Library, who are co-sponsors of the Random Review series. They make programs like this and many other programs possible. Thank you, friends, for all you do. And a reminder that today we will have time for questions at the end of the event. Please submit your questions throughout in the Q&A box that should be visible on your screen, and we'll do our best to answer them at the end. Now I'd like to tell you a little more about today's reviewer, Dr. Helen Gao. Dr. Gao is Medical Director of Clinical Innovations at Lumina Hospice and Palliative Care here in Corvallis. She's also Professor of Medicine with the University of California, San Francisco. She's board certified in internal medicine, geriatrics, and hospice and palliative medicine. Her clinical work has focused on the care of frail, homebound, and vulnerable older adults for the past 15 years. She has particular interests in dementia, home-based care, palliative care, and advocating for the comprehensive care of patients with complex medical social needs. Throughout her career, she's developed a variety of innovative clinical programs to serve the needs of older adults and adults with complex conditions. Since moving to Corvallis in 2016, she's continued to be involved in education, program development, and advocacy for improved care of older adults. She's also been recognized for her excellence nationally and has received numerous awards. She's a recipient of the San Francisco Business Times Healthcare Heroes Award in 2011, the UCSF's Master Clinician Award in 2016, and the American Geriatric Society's Clinician of the Year Award just this year in 2022. Congratulations on that. And Dr. Gao, it is a pleasure to have you here with us today.
Hello. Thank you so much for inviting me to review this book. It was a really fun read, and I hope those of you who haven't read it will have the chance to read it, available at your local library. So the one thing I like about Lisa Genova is that she takes the science of remembering and forgetting and is able to distill it into very vivid examples and stories that make it easy to digest. And I like to think that she very explicitly chose the word art in the subtitle in terms of the science of memory and the art of forgetting, to imply that our brains don't just capture things exactly as they are, as though we had a running video recorder. So how and what we remember, and then how we retrieve and recall our memories, is influenced by a lot of things, including our intent and our practice. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So hopefully everyone can see that. A little bit about Lisa Genova. She's a Harvard PhD in neuroscience, and she's actually probably most well known for her works of fiction, in particular a book called Still Alice, which was subsequently made into a major motion picture, which won a number of awards. So the book Remember is her first nonfiction work. The reason why I'm giving this talk, I think, comes down to my experience with 3 of my 4 grandparents who had dementia. You can see pictured here 2 of my grandparents, my dad's parents. And I saw up close over the years with my family how dementia impacted not only my grandparents, but also our extended family. And over time, this picture of my dad wiping his dad's face, we know that dementia and cognitive issues affect families generation after generation, not necessarily in the meaning that there's a genetic, passage of dementia from one generation to the next, but in terms of caregiving and the impact that care has on families for loved ones that have cognitive issues. And so while most people know me as a palliative care doctor in Corvallis, geriatrics is actually my primary specialty. And I chose geriatrics especially because it has a more holistic approach to older adult care and the care of adults who are experiencing cognitive and functional limitations to their days. And so for the last 15 years, I spent a lot of my time trying to learn more about the brain, as well as helping individuals with dementia and their families navigate the journey with dementia. So let's launch right into the book. So Lisa Genova introduces us to her book by explaining how memories are created. And I think the really remarkable thing about remembering is that it literally changes our brain structurally. So every day, every moment, we experience sensory, emotional, factual elements. And if they're significant enough to us, our brain captures them and undergoes actual structural changes between neurons. There are 4 steps to memory that Lisa Genova describes: encoding, consolidation, storage, and retrieval. So encoding is when our brain captures sights, sounds, information, emotion, meaning, and translates it into a type of neurological language. Consolidation is when our brain, in particular, a part of it called the hippocampus, links previously unrelated information into neural activity that is a single pattern of associated connections. So the hippocampus, which is, if you look at this MRI, the side view, it's kind of a seahorse structure in the middle of the head. It helps us form new memories, but our new memories don't then stay in the hippocampus. It's not like a little memory storage. They then get distributed to discrete regions of the brain where vision, hearing, smell, touch, movement are all mapped. So memory is stored throughout our brain, and the pattern of neural activity that's stimulated when whatever event or information that we had was first experienced gets activated in those other places. With Alzheimer's dementia, we know that Alzheimer's dementia generally causes damage primarily at the start in the hippocampus. And so since the hippocampus is the area where our brain consolidates information, that helps to explain why individuals with Alzheimer's disease often classically have short-term memory loss as their initial early symptoms. Storage is where the pattern of neural activity is maintained over time through persistent structural and chemical changes in our neurons. And then retrieval is kind of what it sounds like. It's when we activate the associated connections in our brain to revisit, recall, know, and recognize what we have previously learned and experienced. Functional MRI scans, such as the MRI that you see here, can show us that when someone has a recall of, say, a photo that they had seen before, the places that light up in the brain are actually the same types of places that light up when a person would see that photo for the very first time. Lisa Genova then goes on to describe a really fascinating case of a gentleman called Henry Mollison. And his case has been sort of described, over half a century. As a child, he had a brain injury that left him with a persistent, very severe, debilitating seizure disorder. Despite several years of trying to control the seizures, he ultimately underwent surgery to remove his entire hippocampus and surrounding brain tissue. So you can see here the diagram showing the areas of the brain that got removed. So it was successful in the sense that, his seizures resolved, which was good. He still retained his personality, his intelligence, his language, his motor function, and his ability to perceive. But because the hippocampus was removed, he could no longer consciously remember any new information or experience for more than a few seconds. So for the rest of his life, any book that he read, any person that he met was all happening for the first time, even if he had just met them the other day, or if it was his mother or a book that he had read. And so he had sort of a permanent state of amnesia. So the hippocampus is this structure that looks a little bit like a seahorse shape in the middle of our brain. In the chapter Pay Attention, Lisa Genova describes that the hippocampus, as good as it is at helping us consolidate memories, it can't consolidate any information into a lasting memory without the neural input of attention. So consider a couple exercises that have been used in different scientific studies. In this diagram, if I asked you to pick out which of these pictures is the true penny, many of you would, pick some, and many of you would probably get it wrong. Similarly, if I asked you to look at this diagram with a whole bunch of apples and ask you which of these is the true Apple computer logo, many of you would probably get it wrong. And this is despite the fact that we have all spent the better part of our lives paying, playing with, collecting, spinning pennies. And for those of us who use Macs or iPhones or Apple Watches, we've probably spent a fair amount of our time staring at the Apple logo as well. So could you identify the real Apple logo and the real penny? The correct penny is from the bottom row, the second one from the left, and the correct Apple logo is the middle row, the second one from the right. Now, if you didn't pick the correct penny and logo from the lineup, don't worry. What Lisa Genova says is, it doesn't mean your memory is bad, because this is not true memory failure, because the memory was never formed in the first place, because you probably never paid attention to what the penny looked like or what the Apple logo looks like. Now, we need to pay attention to, and therefore remember, what we find interesting, meaningful, new, surprising, significant, emotional, or consequential. We don't want to stuff our brains full of memories of every little detail surrounding our lives. So we tend to find what we look for. Now, this is interesting to think about because if you're an optimist, you pay attention to positive experiences. If on the flip side, you're feeling more depressed, you tend to consolidate things that match your mood, and you tend not to pay attention to the things that are happy events and pleasant experiences because they don't align with your mood. So Lisa Genova then goes on to describe several different types of memory. So in the chapter In the Moment, she describes working memory. And working memory is brief. It's kind of like short-term memory, but it lasts a little bit longer, and it's involved in manipulation of information to help us with processing. So working memory is essentially what we are paying attention to right now. And it lasts and helps us process so that it helps us stitch one moment to the next, giving us a contiguous experience of what's going on. As an example, while I was reading this book, Remember, I don't memorize each word as I go along, word for word. The sentence that I read and then move on to the next sentence, that prior sentence will get discarded from my working memory almost immediately after I've read it and moved on to the next sentence. I read it and hold on to it long enough to help me make the connection to the next sentence and thereby read a paragraph in the whole book, but it doesn't by any means stay in my brain. I couldn't regurgitate the whole book for you. So many people have probably heard about this idea that we can generally remember 7 items, fairly easily. And phone numbers, if you don't count the area code, are created as 7-digit numbers. And there is actually a fair amount of science behind this. So we can hold visual information in kind of an internal brain scratch pad and auditory information in sort of an internal brain audio recording for about 15 to 30 seconds. In general, we can remember 7 plus or minus 2 things for 15 to 30 seconds in our working memory. We can increase that by doing something called chunking. And by this, we mean that if I were to give you this string of 10 numbers or this random string of letters, it would probably be really hard for you to remember these quickly and be able to tell them back to me. If, however, you chunk them in a more obvious, familiar way, you see a phone number and you see the sentence, my name is Helen Gao. You've now taken these random neutral objects and items and made them into something that's a little bit more meaningful for you and something that is now much more easier for you to remember. Now, if you have information that you've brought into your working memory that is significant and meaningful to you, then that moves then from your working memory to the hippocampus and then gets stored as more permanent memory. So muscle memory, and I think people hear about muscle memory a lot. This is something that's bound together by a place in our brain called the basal ganglia with feedback from the cerebellum, which is in the back of the head. Muscle memory is our ability to reproduce a particular movement without conscious thought. It's the repetition and focused practice that allows us to take complex sequences of previously unrelated physical movements and bind them together and execute them as a single action. So, for instance, this isn't my daughter, but my 4 and my almost 6-year-old, every morning and every night, we ask them to brush their teeth. And of course, when you're a toddler, the first time that you brush your teeth, you don't do a really good job because it's quite laborious. You got to figure out how to angle the toothbrush to cover the surfaces of your teeth. And so it takes practice, but over time, with enough practice toothbrushing, hopefully you become masterful enough that you can brush your teeth without thinking about it and without consciously thinking about which way you're angling your toothbrush to cover the surfaces of your teeth. So muscle memories are remarkably stable once we actually embed them in our brain, even if they're unused for decades. We know that muscle memory is generally unconscious and it's remembered below our awareness. So brain scans such as functional MRIs like this show the motor cortex areas that get activated by skills. And we know that the more we practice the skill, those areas will enlarge as we progress from novice to master. So think about it. When you're 3, the area of your brain that handles toothbrushing is going to be itty bitty teeny tiny. And by the time you're a skilled toothbrusher, you're going to have an enlarged part of that area of your brain. So if you say take a professional violinist, how their brain looks is very different from that of an amateur violinist. The amateur's functional MRI, as you can see here on the left, and this isn't specifically a violinist, but it's just an example. It shows more extensive areas lighting up because it is so much more difficult for an amateur to play a piece of violin music. It takes a lot more different parts of the brain to coordinate together to make that violin work and sound right. A professional violinist, however, they have trained the areas of their brain that control playing the violin. And you can see that on the right side, the areas that line up are much more focused because the specific areas that they need to competently play the violin are working really, really well in playing that violin. I think what's phenomenal about muscle memory is that having it be subconscious or unconscious is actually really helpful if you think about the fact that being able to do embedded muscle memory actions allows us to sort of multitask. So for instance, I can walk and drink a cup of coffee and talk at the same time without thinking about where my feet have to go from step to step, without having to think about how to aim the cup to my lips without spilling, and while I discuss the election results. So our brains have an unlimited capacity to create muscle memories, which means for everyone out there in the audience, it's never too late to pick up a new skill, whether it's piano or violin. In the chapter, Your Brain's Wikipedia, Lisa Genova talks about semantic memory. Semantic memory is a type of long-term memory involving the capacity to recall words, concepts, numbers, language, and facts. It's long-term and it's considered timeless. If we want to know more information, if we essentially want to increase our semantic memory, we have to create the memories, and that takes study and practice and repetition over time. And we also have to actively retrieve the information as well, because repeated retrieval beats out repeated study. So for those who might still be in school, if you're trying to cram for your physics test, don't just, study and read the same information over again. If you actually give yourself little exercises and tests to make yourself retrieve the information, you will be much better suited to performing well on your physics exam. So this is an image of Akira Haraguchi, who was a retired engineer from Japan. He holds the world record for the number of digits of pi that he has memorized, which is, hold your breath, 117,000 digits. I'm asking, why in the world would he want to do that? But that's another conversation. So he uses a number of different strategies to help him be able to remember the digits of pi. And mnemonics is one of those tools that he uses. Now, we don't have to memorize pi to increase the amount of knowledge that we have. In particular, for most people, memorizing pi is probably a little bit boring, not something that is high on your priority list. So as we've talked about before, our brain is not interested in knowing what's boring or unimportant to us. If you want to know more stuff and fill your brain with more semantic memory, you want to take in information that is meaningful to you. So I'm going to give you just a quick example. When I was a medical student in training, as all medical students do, you learn how to write hospital admission orders. And you have to write, admit to, inpatient unit, blah, 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 what the diagnosis is, what the condition of the patient is. And so there's a very common mnemonic in medical training, and it goes ADC, vandalism. And that's how we learn all the different components of what has to be written in admission orders. And at some point in my medical school training, a couple of friends and I decided, well, we were going to change up that mnemonic, and we began to call it ADC Van Dismal. Now, that doesn't really give you a good sentence or anything, because, what's a van and what's dismal? But we like dismal because, frankly, a lot of the times when we're in the hospital working 36 hours, we were a little bit dismal. But by doing that mnemonic, we were able to embed the order and the needs of an admission order set in our heads. And even now, even though I don't do a lot of hospital care, I can spout off ADC vandalism or ADC vandismal and tell you what's needed. So in the next chapter, what happened, Lisa Genova describes episodic memory. So episodic memory is our conscious long-term memory about personal experiences. And these are essentially, you remembering you, I myself remembering myself. We've already described how the brain tends to favor and prioritize things that are meaningful and emotional. Emotion and surprise tend to activate a part of the brain called the amygdala, which you can see here is in yellow, and it's kind of at the tip of the hippocampus. The amygdala, when it senses something kind of deeply emotional or surprising, it kind of sends a message to the hippocampus and says, hey, this is really important, and we want you to remember this. A flashbulb memory contains a lot of vivid, detailed information in episodic memory, and it is what we call memory that comes from very dramatic experiences. And this could be positive or negative. So for instance, there are many people who have flashbulb memories of the day they got proposed to, or the birth of their child, and also negative flashbulb memories. So for instance, the morning of September 11th, 2001, I can tell you with fair detail that I was a third-year medical student at San Francisco General Hospital, and all the TVs in all of the patients' rooms were replaying the collapse of the Twin Towers. And that was my experience of September 11th. Strung together, all of the episodic memory, including flashbulb memories that we have, kind of create our life story. So another way of describing episodic memory is our autobiographical memory. Some things to know is that the first age, on average, that we develop episodic memory is age 3. And episodic memories that we choose to spend time with is up to us. So we can help ourselves create episodic memories by, as Lisa Genova describes, doing a number of things. First, get out of a routine. So routine things tend to become boring and neutral and not that meaningful and significant. So if you break your routine, you're more likely to have an experience that is meaningful enough for you to store as episodic memory. Pay attention, because we know that you need attention to form memory in the first place. Get in touch with your feelings, because you need the amygdala to send the message to the hippocampus to store the information. And so having something that is meaningful emotionally to you and in the way that you feel is something that you're more likely to remember. Rehash it. So in the same way that you need to encode the memory, you also have to be able to review and reflect on it, talk about it, reminisce, because that brings those memories back up for you and embeds them deeper. Keep a journal, use social media sparingly and photos to trigger recall, and consider the ways that technology can enhance the way that you remember things, whether it's in taking videos or photos or making little autobiographical sketches for yourself. So at this point, Lisa Genova pivots from talking about memory to talking about forgetting. So your memories for what happened are wrong. I love the title of this chapter because it's sort of like, whoa, really? And what she describes is that, we talked about the 4 steps that are required to make memory. And what we know is at every step in our memory processing, our brain is vulnerable to editing and inaccuracy. So our memory is actually not like a videotape that we play back and see the exact same movie. We really only encode little slices that capture our interest of what happened. So our episodic memories are incomplete from the get-go. Each time that we retrieve a memory, we reconstruct the story, and then we reconsolidate the changed 2.0 version of the memory, and maybe the 3.0 version, the 4.0 version, however many times that we revisit that memory. We also know that language and circumstances and how we feel emotionally, all kinds of different factors can affect how we reconsolidate and adapt a memory. So there was a really wonderful study that Lisa Genova describes in her book, which looks at subjects who are shown a video of a car accident. Later, they were asked to identify how fast the cars were going. They were asked in context of when the cars smashed together, or how fast were the cars going when they collided together, or how fast were the cars going when they bumped into each other. And the subject's reconstruction of their memory of what happened tended to match the intensity of the verb that was offered in the question. Another real-world example is, as we probably all know, there are hundreds of innocent Americans who have been exonerated of crimes based on new DNA evidence. What Lisa Genova wrote is that 75% of those individuals had been convicted erroneously of their crime by a single eyewitness testimony. So all of these supposed eyewitness testimonies essentially have been proven wrong. In her next chapter, Lisa Genova describes something called tip of the tongue. It's one of the most common experiences of memory failure, known as blocking or tip of the tongue. Word and information is actually still stored in our brain, but we temporarily can't retrieve it. And the frequency of tip of the tongue does increase with age because of reduced processing speeds. Now, blocking can occur when there is only partial or weak activation of the neurons that connect to the word that we're looking for. And it can happen when there is insufficient activation between the stored information about the word or name that we're looking for and the spelling or sound of that word. Usually, a third to half of these instances are going to resolve on their own. So an example is, sometimes we're trying to remember someone's name, and at my kids' schools, I meet new parents, and then the next time I'm embarrassed because I can't remember what their name was. So if you think about the name, Mr. Baker, it's a fairly neutral, generic, abstract name. And in this case, this is a picture of our former Secretary of State, James Baker, so some people may know him. But the name itself, Mr. Baker, for many people might not be anything particularly memorable to be easy to retrieve. So one way to think about how to remember certain things, such as abstract words and names, is to try to find things that are a little bit more sort of visually easy to retrieve and to sort of understand. And that's what Lisa Genova calls the Baker paradox. Now, you might not remember just the abstract name, Mr. Baker, but you generally know what a baker of bread does. And maybe you love bread, or you have a favorite bakery, and you know that the motion of baking is this wonderful kneading of dough. And then the next time you meet, James Baker, you're like, oh, right, Baker, you're Mr. Baker. In the chapter, Don't Forget to Remember, Lisa Genova describes something called prospective memory. And this is our memory for what you need to do later. We're all susceptible to forgetting a lot, which is why having checklists become really helpful. Prospective memory is when you're creating an intention for your future you. It's your brain's to-do list, but it is poorly supported by our neural circuitry, and it's fraught with failure. Which is why if you think about a lot of the professions, such as airline pilots or surgeons, they all have very explicit checklists that they have to go through. And now checklists are only as helpful as we actually use them. But different ways to help ourselves with prospective memory is to use tools that are available in our day-to-day lives. So not just checklists, but to-do lists, entry information on a calendar, being specific about a plan. So instead of saying, I'm going to exercise tomorrow, you might say, I'm going to run with my friend at 6 a.m. Using pill boxes for folks who have a lot of medications to keep track of, placing cues in impossible to miss locations. So for instance, if I need to bring the next batch of Play-Doh to my kids' preschool, I'm going to stick it right by the front door so that I'm sure that I'm either going to trip on it or I will remember to bring it into the car. And then be aware if your routine has been disrupted. So oftentimes if we get out of our usual routine, something that we might normally have done or remembered is no longer in our normal kind of pathway, our routine pathway. In her chapter, This Too Shall Pass, Lisa Genova describes that, without deliberate attempts or strategies to retain what we learn, we'll forget most of what we experience almost right away. And whether a memory fades depends on what you do with the information once it's stored. So we've talked a little bit about this in that once you actually encode information, it's worth retrieving it. So repetition, revisiting information is helpful, and assigning, again, bring back the emotion and the importance and significance of something. So the meaning, assigning that gives memory more relevance and encourages these memories to stay in our brain longer. So without use, if we have stored a memory, but then we never retrieve it, we don't repeat it, or maybe it loses significance, most of our memories will fade quickly over time. And if there is a memory that manages to hang on over time, either we've repeated it enough or we've retrieved it enough, then eventually that will likely be a very permanent memory. An example for me of things that fade is that I was actually a double major in English literature and language and East Asian literature and language when I was in college. I learned Chinese, I learned to read, I learned to write. And yet despite having studied it and being one of my college majors, I then subsequently, just for different reasons, didn't really have much opportunity to use or speak or read Chinese. And now, over 20 years later, and I embarrassingly can read almost no Chinese characters still, and my speaking competence has also diminished greatly. Forget about it. So this is Lisa Genova's next chapter. If you want to forget a memory, then it's important to resist activating the neural circuitry of the unwanted memory, because each time you retrieve it, reinforces it. And a good example of this might be, for instance, when someone has PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. And lots of people, not just veterans, can have PTSD. And we now know that there are actually types of focused therapy where someone, under the guidance of a trained therapist, can revisit the painful traumatic memories. And with guidance, they can reformat and reconsolidate those memories, perhaps replacing them with, again, what we talked about, the version 2.0, the version 3.0, which is a kinder, gentler, and emotionally more neutral version of that original traumatic experience. So, an optimally functioning memory system is a fine balance between storage and data disposal, remembering and forgetting. One type of memory that's a little bit different from this is the muscle memory, because muscle memory is subconscious. It is impervious to conscious dismissal. So in order to replace muscle memory, you need to actually practice something new. So in my case, when I was pregnant and having my kids, I decided I was going to get back into swimming. I had a horrible freestyle stroke. But I was at 40 something at this time, and that bad stroke was sort of embedded in me. I just kept doing a bad stroke. And so I had to take some lessons, relearn how to do a better, not great, freestyle stroke, and doing the practice and practice and practice that helps you replace a prior muscle memory with a newer muscle memory. Normal aging. So I often get the question, what are normal aging cognitive changes? And Lisa Genova describes this in her book. So free recall ability declines with age. Working memory declines with age. Information tends to disappear faster. Processing speed declines with age. It takes longer to learn new information and to retrieve stored information. But you can see from this that with normal aging, even though it takes longer, it doesn't mean that you can't learn new information. Recognition and familiarity tend to be stable. And that's, again, because semantic information tends to be very permanent and stored. As we grow older, we share increasing tendencies to recall the good stuff and forget the bad stuff. And that's kind of nice. Now, if, say, we are the 1 in 3 adults or 1 in 2 adults, as in some cases maybe, who develop a neurodegenerative disorder, say Alzheimer's, then we experience something that is not just normal aging. At this point, it is what we would call pathologic cognitive impairment. So Alzheimer's is very distinct from normal aging changes. It is not just slower processing, diminished attention, or tip of the tongue lapses. In the early stages of Alzheimer's dementia, the dementia results because there is an impasse in the neural synapse, so the connection from one neuron to the other, as you can see in this diagram. You get amyloid beta forming these kind of sticky plaques in the nerve synapses, and over the course of about 15 to 20 years of accumulation, that individual will eventually reach a tipping point where there's suddenly a molecular cascade of these tangles, what we call neurofibrillary tangles, neuroinflammation, so inflammation of the brain, and actual cell death, so neuron death. And that is what causes the symptomatic cognitive impairment that we see in Alzheimer's. Now, Alzheimer's, as I've described before, it starts in the hippocampus. So an early symptom that almost everyone with Alzheimer's has is poor short-term memory. But another change over time is failure with language, the inability to retrieve words and names, and the need to use simpler and simpler words. So this isn't just tip of the tongue kind of difficulty retrieval. This is where instead of using the word, I need to prepare the document, the person might say, I need to prepare the paper. And then over time, as the dementia progresses, it's, I need to prepare the thingy. As Alzheimer's progresses from early stages to later and end stages, and the trajectory tends to be 8 to 10 years on average, although that really varies because people many times get diagnosed very, very late in their process because the changes are assumed to be normal. But another change is that the damage not extends beyond the hippocampus and can go to other parts of the brain. So the parietal lobes, which you see here in yellow, this can affect spatial memory and visual spatial processing. And so this is when someone begins to get lost, they get disoriented, even in familiar environments. It can go to the frontal, prefrontal cortices here in red, and it impairs the frontal lobe's ability for logical thinking, decision-making, planning, and problem solving. It can go in the deep middle part of the brain, as we've talked about, to the amygdala, or kind of the locus of where we experience a lot of emotion and mood, and we see dysregulation of mood and emotion. And so this is when we see some of the, quote, behavioral symptoms of dementia, such as grief and rage and sexual disinhibition, etc. It can also affect muscle memory circuits. So, all of these subconscious activities that we don't have to think about to do, all of a sudden we have more and more difficulty as our Alzheimer's progresses, and we no longer can figure out how to button our shirt, how to even weave our arm through the sleeve of the shirt. We don't know how to brush our teeth. We've forgotten how to toilet, and then it can extend even to the level of not remembering at a subconscious level how the muscles of the mouth and the throat can chew and swallow food. Eventually, the neuronal damage that happens in Alzheimer's begins to destroy even the oldest stored long-term memories. So, separate from Alzheimer's, which again can be a very devastating illness, if we think about normal memory and forgetting processes, it's important to know that, context really matters. To improve our ability to remember, matching the context that we're in for recall with the conditions, whether it's external, like the time, the place, the people around us, or internal context, such as our emotional or psychological state. If we can match when we're recalling it with the time that the event actually happened, we're more likely to be successful in retrieving that information. Lisa Genova also talks about stress and the impact that stress has, both on, in some cases, enhancing, but in many cases, making difficult our memory and forgetting processes. So acute stress enhances the formation of new memories, but our attention is narrowed, and the details available for consolidation are also narrowed. There's an optimal level of temporary stress to create memories related to a stressful situation. And that's, evolutionarily important, because you want to be able to remember the situation that got you into the place where you were staring down a lion who's about to eat you. But stress over time impairs our retrieval ability. So when we have an acute stress response, as seen in this diagram, we have adrenaline firing, and that is sort of saying short-lived emergency, run, fight, flee. And, we don't want to be thinking, logically in that moment. We just got to run. And so it inhibits thinking at that moment. And then cortisol kind of kicks in about 15 to 60 minutes later to shut off the stress response. Both of these trigger norepinephrine in the amygdala, and it tells the hippocampus, as we mentioned before, amygdala says to hippocampus, this is really important. You've got to remember this. Acute stress enhances the formation of new memories, but our attention is narrowed, as we described, because you don't want to be in a stressful situation and be sort of thinking and trying to remember all of the diffuse, endless details around you. So what happens over time is that, the emotional part of our brain, sometimes what we call the lizard brain, or the amygdala area, if we are constantly under stress, we spend all of our time in emotional lizard brain area. Chronic stress then over time makes it hard for us to spend time in the cognitive part of our brain, the thinking part of our brain. or in the prefrontal cortex. We also know that sleep has a major role in terms of memory formation and sort of brain health. So being able to go to sleep and get a solid night's sleep, most adults need to average around 8 hours, maybe 7 to 9 hours. Sleep is the time when our bodies and our brains consolidate information. So all of that neuronal activity that we were going through during the day is now consolidated when we sleep and stored into memory so that we can recall it when we wake up. The sleep time is also when these cells called glial cells, they're kind of like the janitors of the brain, flush away debris and amyloid. And so if we are chronically sleep deprived, our glial cells do not have the opportunity to clean away amyloid from our brain. And we are more likely to suffer from accumulation of amyloid over time. So as she wraps up her book, Lisa Genova, I think reminds us that even though memory seems like this wonderful thing that, we want to have more of, life really would not be better if we remembered every detail of everything. As I said before, we don't want to just pack our brains with all kinds of memory of everything. What we do want to be able to do is to expect our memory to not forget the things that are meaningful to us, the memories that provide us with a sense of self, a life narrative, and gives us the potential for growth and connection with others. And with that, at the end of her book, which I am not putting into this discussion today, she gives a lot of very practical, step-by-step activities and things that we can do in our day-to-day life, whether it's diet, exercise, sleep, to enhance our memory and improve the way that our memory can work for us. And with that, I will stop sharing the screen and open up for questions.
Thank you so much. Memory is so interesting and so complicated, and
Yes.
there's a lot to learn there. That's great. If people have questions, now would be a great time to submit them. There are none coming up at the moment. Oh, here's one. Let's see. How do people with total recall feel about remembering everything? Does it overwhelm them? I think she talks about that a little bit in the book, but
Yeah.
maybe give some input on that.
So Lisa Genova actually does describe that in her book. So if you do read her book, there's a section where she describes sort of these super memory individuals who do remember every single detail of every day and every moment. You could tell them, tell me what you were doing on April 4th, 1972, and they would be able to tell you what they were doing. And it's described that it feels like a tremendous burden to them. And what she describes, one person doing is trying to actively kind of imagine discarding some of the excess memories. But it is, we're not designed in normal ways to remember everything because it kind of clutters a lot of what is meaningful to us. And so there are very few, I think she said there were like maybe 62 known people or 65 known people who have these super memories.
Great, thank you. Another question, Adam asks, my earliest memories are very stable and don't change each time I recall them. Is that typical? So it sounds like you're saying they're not overwritten or modified or version 2.0 so much, but seem pretty stable.
So it doesn't mean that they're not susceptible to it. It may just be that how you recall them and re-experience them is stable and always how you are wanting to remember them. And then the more you imagine them the exact same way, the more they encode and embed in that way. So.
Great. And Kim asks, will your memory improve if you start to sleep well after having years of not sleeping well? So can you make up for lost sleep?
I don't know if it will change past encoding of memories and retrieval, but I would imagine that, if like many of us, you've suffered from poor sleep or lack of sleep, sleep deprivation, that if you're able to get to a place in your life and schedule where you can have more steady routine, high quality sleep, that at least from that point on, you will have better experiences encoding new memories and retrieving them.
It's interesting. I had recently come across an article that said if you get too much sleep, it can also lead towards early onset dementia, which is unusual because
Yeah,
I had not heard that before. But,
yeah.
Another question here, does Lisa Genova talk about the extinction of memory?
She did not really talk about the extinction of memory, although I'm wondering, to that audience member, if you're talking about sort of taking a memory and trying to dispose of it or get rid of it. I mean, she does describe, as I went very cursorily over in the presentation, how to try to forget about a memory. For instance, in ways that PTSD therapy can do. Yeah, I don't know if I answered that question.
He followed up with that with a question like, and the resistance to extinction of memories stored in the amygdala. So it does sound like kind of the forgetting kind of, I think, that she talks about maybe. And yeah, great. Let's see. So here's a question from an anonymous. I know there are other kinds of dementia other than Alzheimer's. Do other types of dementia progress differently in terms of how they lead to memory loss? Yes,
that's a great question. So there are lots of different types of dementias. So some other types are Lewy body dementia, frontotemporal dementia, progressive supranuclear palsy, and Parkinson's can also cause types of dementia. Something called NPH can mimic dementia. Each of these are distinct. And sorry, there's also vascular dementia or dementia related to, say, a past history of strokes. So yes, these do vary differently. And I should say that, for many years, the diagnosis of dementia really rested on this crux of someone having identifiable memory impairment. But now we know that memory does not have to be a primary deficit for some of these other types of dementia, and may not be present in the early stages of other types of dementia. So you could have a diagnosis of dementia and not actually have short-term memory problems at the early part of your disease. And so how different types of dementia are diagnosed and progress depends, again, on the type of dementia, where the injury is in the brain, because again, there's many different areas of the brain that help us process different cognitive and physical functionings. And so how it progresses depends, Lewy body dementia, frontotemporal dementia are somewhat more similar to Alzheimer's in that there's sort of a progressive type of decline, whereas we sometimes think of vascular dementia or what's dementia related to strokes or blood flow problems to the brain injury as more stepwise, because it depends on when that person, say, has a stroke or a TIA and the stepwise decline that may happen with vascular dementia.
Great. Wow. Thank you. So another question is, in a person with dementia, is there a way of reinforcing muscle memory of important functions?
That's a great question. And it's difficult because muscle memory is subconscious. So it's difficult to kind of, as someone is losing those neural connections, to train back up to it. Usually by the time that you're noticing that someone is having difficulty figuring out how to get dressed, certainly there are tools and strategies to try to help someone be able to get dressed independently still. So you might go from switching out button shirts to shirts that don't require buttons. But it is hard to retrain the brain in those advanced stages of a dementia to relearn muscle memory that is being lost. For instance, swallowing, sometimes you can do some tactile stroking the under part of the throat and the neck to remind someone by physically touching them to swallow if there's someone who's kind of holding a food bolus in their mouth. But even that over time won't help and work. And again, that's more of just a tactile clue, not so much that you're retraining that person to swallow correctly.
Great. And another audience member asks, so we need to be humble when discussing our memory of events with others. We cannot trust them. So, I mean, I think Lisa Genova talks a lot about how much our memories change throughout time. And you mentioned people that were let off for DNA, proving that the eyewitnesses were not correct. So how much can we trust our memories?
Another great question. I think it's not so much I think I would think of it less as, can we trust, can I trust my memory because it's giving me false information? And then I can't trust anything that I remember. Who we are as individuals, how we conceive of ourselves, which is a big component of what our memories are there for. We create who we are, and we have a role in creating our identity, our autobiographical history. And it's not so much that you can't trust what you created, but there was a reason that you probably created it to support or feed the person that you identify as. Now, I might have an experience when I was age 5 that is very different from how my brother, who's 2 years older, remembers it. And that's okay. We might remember it in different ways, but that's how I remember it and retrieve it and recall it and re-encode it. And he might, if it was meaningful for him, remember it a different way. So I guess I would think about it less as, we can't trust our memories. It's a negative and a bad thing, as just that we are individual people. And in the way that she describes this, not just as a science, but as an art, we are creating who we are and what we remember as we go along in life. So.
Great. And I think we have time for about one more question. And there's a question here about, are there good tests for diagnosing early stage dementia?
That's a good question. So how dementia is diagnosed is a mix of clinical evaluation. So yes, some cognitive testing. It could include neuropsychologic testing, so a series, a battery of tests that look at visual spatial processing and language and reasoning and judgment, emotional states. And, while brain scans are not the make it or break it for dementias, technology and brain imaging and certain types of scanning are becoming more helpful in certain types of diagnoses. There is still a lot of work being done in terms of blood tests and cerebral spinal fluid tests to help identify, say, people who might be at early stages, maybe even a kind of just just a cognitive impairment stage, not even early dementia. Some of these things like blood tests, spinal fluid tests are not readily available for your typical primary care provider, not even necessary for a lot of neurologists. They're being done at research levels. So I think there's still a lot of work being done to help people identify, how to see if you have a risk for developing dementia down the line or if you're at early stages. But to define an early stage of dementia, you require at least 2 deficits in different cognitive domains, and they need to be impairing your function in some way.
That's interesting. So lots of people worry, I've forgotten something, my memory, I'm losing my memory, so I must have early onset dementia, but that's not, it's normal to forget, right? So,
yes. Normal to forget. We forget all the time.
That's right.
We have to.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it. It was a wonderful review, and thank you for giving your time to this.
Yeah, thank you.
Have a nice day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.